My dear love, falling in love with your best friend. It's the kind of story that should last forever. But what if fate had other plans? This is the story of love, loss, and the moments that make life truly unforgettable. A love so deep, so real, but destined to end in heartbreak. Stay with me until the end, because some love stories deserve to be told. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more touching stories like this to life. I never knew the exact moment I fell in love with him. Maybe it happened the first time we met, or maybe it was in the thousands of little moments that followed. The way he laughed without restraint, the way he made everything feel lighter. His name was Ethan. We met at the start of college, two young guys still figuring out life, our futures uncertain but full of possibilities. I was always the quiet one, the one who hesitated before speaking, who observed before acting. Ethan was the opposite. He spoke with his hands, laughed with his entire body, and had this way of looking at people, like he could see straight through them, into every unspoken thought and hidden feeling. And somehow, he saw me. At first, we were just friends. Long conversations about everything and nothing at all. Late-night texts that stretched until sunrise because neither of us wanted to stop talking. His casual touches that lingered a second too long. And then, one day, it became impossible to ignore. The way my heart raced when he was near. The way my chest ached when he laughed with someone else. The way I wanted more. But how do you tell your best friend that you've fallen for them? How do you say the words when you have no idea if they feel the same? I kept it in for so long, afraid of ruining what we had. Until one night, I just couldn't anymore. It was a cold November evening. We were walking back from dinner, our breath visible in the crisp air, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. The conversation had faded, replaced by something heavier, something unsaid. Ethan glanced at me, his blue eyes searching. "You okay?" My pulse pounded. The words sat in my throat, begging to be spoken. I took a shaky breath. I think I like you." Silence. A long, suffocating pause. My heart stopped. And then Ethan smiled, and in that moment, my world changed forever. Ethan smiled. He smiled. I wasn't expecting that. I had played out this moment in my head 1,000 times before, and none of those scenarios included him smiling. Awkward silence? Yes. A forced laugh? Probably. A look of pity? That was my biggest fear. But Ethan was smiling. It wasn't a teasing smirk, not the kind he gave when he was about to mess with me. It was something else, something softer, almost hesitant. The cold air pressed against my skin as I waited for him to say something. Anything. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the distant sound of cars passing by. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ethan exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "Wow," he murmured, running a hand through his hair. I wasn't expecting that. I swallowed hard. Yeah, neither was I. He looked at me again, really looked at me, his blue eyes searching for something. I wasn't sure if he found it, but after a few seconds, he did something I never saw coming. He reached out and took my hand, just like that. No hesitation, no awkwardness, just warmth. His fingers wrapped around mine, firm but gentle. My breath hitched, and my first instinct was to pull away, to tell myself this wasn't real, that he was only doing this because he felt bad for me. But he didn't let go. "I don't know what to say," Ethan admitted. His voice was quieter now, almost uncertain. "I mean, I never really thought about us that way. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I guess I just assumed. He trailed off, his gaze flickering to our joined hands. But now that you said it, I can't stop thinking about it. My heart clenched. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. Is that bad? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. No, it's just new. New. That word sat between us, heavy with possibility. I had spent so much time assuming Ethan could never feel the same way that I never considered what would happen if he didn't reject me outright, if he wasn't sure. Was that better? Was it worse? His thumb brushed against my knuckles absent-mindedly, sending a jolt of warmth up my arm. Can we just not rush this? He asked, tilting his head slightly. I don't want to say something just because it's what I think you want to hear. I stared at him. He was being honest. Ethan never said things just to make people feel better. He wasn't cruel, but he was never the type to sugarcoat things. If he had no feelings for me, he would have said it. So the fact that he wasn't saying it meant he was considering it. My chest tightened. Was that hope? Or was I setting myself up for heartbreak? I nodded slowly. Yeah, we don't have to rush. He gave my hand one last squeeze before letting go, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Cool. We started walking again, side by side. This time, the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of questions, unspoken thoughts, possibilities neither of us fully understood yet. By the time we reached my apartment, Ethan stopped at the door, rocking on his heels. Hey, he said, glancing at me. No matter what happens, we're good, okay? I wanted to believe that. I really did. But deep down, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I gave him a small nod. Yeah, we're good. Ethan grinned, as if that settled everything. All right. See you tomorrow? Yeah, tomorrow. He left with a small wave, disappearing into the night. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. My heart was still racing, my fingers still tingling where he had touched me. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time, there was a chance, and that was enough to keep me hoping. The next few days were filled with an unspoken tension. Ethan and I still hung out, still talked, still laughed at stupid jokes. But something had shifted. It was in the way his eyes lingered on me a second too long. It was in the way our hands brushed more often than before. It was in the way my heart ached every time he hesitated before saying goodbye. I told myself I wouldn't push. He had asked for time, and I had agreed. But waiting was torture. And then, it happened. We were at his apartment, watching some mindless action movie neither of us was really paying attention to. The only light in the room came from the TV, casting flickering shadows across the couch where we sat, closer than usual, our legs barely an inch apart. Ethan was quiet, not his usual kind of quiet, but the kind that made my stomach tighten, like he was lost in his own thoughts. Then, out of nowhere, he reached for my hand. It wasn't like the last time. That night had been a reaction, something instinctive, something he hadn't really thought through, but now it was intentional. His fingers brushed against mine, hesitant at first, like he was testing the weight of his own decision. Then, slowly, he laced them together. I froze. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I turned my head to look at him, and he was already staring at me. Really staring. My mouth went dry. Ethan. He exhaled sharply, his grip tightening around my hand. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted, his voice quiet, almost frustrated. I don't know what this means, but I know that when I think about you, it's different now." His words sent a spark through me. Different. I had spent so long thinking he would never see me that way. And now, here he was, saying it out loud. I swallowed hard. "Do you want this?" A pause. Ethan let out a breath that sounded like a surrender. "I think I do," he whispered. And then, before I could even process it, he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, soft, warm, uncertain. My whole body went still, my brain short-circuiting. It wasn't a deep kiss, wasn't urgent or desperate. It was careful, like he was afraid of breaking something fragile, like he was afraid of breaking me. When he pulled away, his eyes searched mine, waiting for a reaction. I felt lightheaded, overwhelmed, terrified, and completely, utterly in love. But before I could say anything, before I could even take a full breath, his phone rang. The moment shattered. Ethan cursed under his breath and grabbed his phone, glancing at the screen. His face changed. The warmth in his eyes flickered, replaced by something distant. "Shit," he muttered. "It's my doctor." A cold knot twisted in my stomach. "Doctor?" He hesitated. "Yeah, it's nothing, just something I've been dealing with." I stared at him, my heart hammering. Something about his tone felt wrong. He gave me a tight smile, pressing the phone to his ear. "Hey, Doc, what's up?" I watched him as he listened to the voice on the other end, and in that moment, I knew. Something was wrong. Something was really, really wrong. Ethan's voice was steady, but his fingers were gripping the phone too tightly. His eyes darted toward me for a second before he stood up and walked to the other side of the room, his back turned to me. I sat frozen on the couch, my heartbeat thudding against my ribs. Something was wrong. I couldn't hear what the doctor was saying, but I could see it on Ethan's face. The way his jaw clenched, the way his shoulders tensed. Then I heard him exhale sharply. "Yeah. Okay. I understand." His voice was different, flat, unreadable. A few seconds later, he hung up. I swallowed hard. "Ethan." He turned around slowly, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked scared. That's when I knew whatever this was, it wasn't nothing. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a humorless chuckle. "Well, that wasn't the call I wanted to get tonight." I waited. He hesitated, then sat down beside me, his knee brushing mine. But this time, he didn't reach for my hand. I hated the silence stretching between us. Finally, I whispered, "What did they say?" Ethan let out a breath. "It's my blood work." He paused, then shook his head. "There's something wrong with it." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean, something wrong?" His fingers tapped against his knee, restless. "They need to run more tests, but they're worried it's serious." The air in the room suddenly felt too heavy. Serious. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until I felt my lungs burn. "Ethan." He forced a small, crooked smile. "Hey, don't look at me like that. It's probably nothing." But I knew that wasn't true. Because Ethan wasn't the kind of person to worry over nothing. He wasn't the kind of person to get scared. And right now, sitting in front of me, he was terrified. I felt the overwhelming urge to do something, to reach for him, to fix it, to promise him everything would be okay. But I wasn't sure if that was true. So instead, I asked the only thing I could. "When do you find out?" He rubbed his hands over his face. "I have more tests scheduled next week. Then, I guess we see what happens." Next week. It felt too far away, and yet not far enough. For a long moment, we just sat there. The movie on the TV had ended, the screen frozen on the credits. The world outside kept moving, but inside this apartment, time felt like it had stopped. Then, Ethan did something that broke me. He reached for my hand. His grip was tighter this time, almost desperate. And that's when I realized something. He needed me to be okay with this. He needed me not to panic, not to break down, not to show how much I already felt like my heart was splitting in two. So I swallowed the fear clawing its way up my throat and nodded. "All right," I whispered. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Ethan let out a shaky breath, and for the first time since that phone call, his eyes softened. "Yeah," he said, squeezing my hand. "Together." I smiled. I pretended to believe it. But deep down, I was terrified I'd already started losing him. The days after Ethan's phone call were a blur. We tried to keep things normal. Late-night conversations, stupid jokes, the way we always had been. But beneath every laugh, beneath every casual touch, there was something neither of us wanted to say out loud. We were waiting for the test results, waiting for the truth, waiting for something we weren't ready to face. And then the call came. I was at work when my phone buzzed. Ethan. My heart stuttered. I hesitated for a second before answering. "Hey." He didn't say anything at first. Just a deep breath, the kind people take before their world changes. Then, softly, "Can you come over?" I didn't ask any questions. I just grabbed my keys and left. When I got to his apartment, the door was already unlocked. I pushed it open slowly, stepping inside. Ethan was sitting on the couch, hunched over, elbows on his knees. His phone was on the coffee table, the screen still lit from the last call. His hands were shaking. I didn't think. I just went to him. "Ethan." My voice was barely above a whisper. He looked up at me, and that's when I saw it. The fear. His blue eyes were clouded, his usual light dimmed. I had never seen him like this. "It's bad," he said, voice hoarse. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Bad. I swallowed hard. How bad? Ethan let out a bitter chuckle, shaking his head. Stage 3. I stopped breathing. Stage 3. I knew what that meant. Not the worst, not the end, but still serious. Still something that could take him away from me. I sat down beside him, my hands clenched into fists. What do they do now? Chemo, treatments, hope for the best. He exhaled sharply, then forced a small smile. Could be worse, right? I stared at him. Even now, he was trying to be strong for me. I didn't know what to say. No words felt enough. So I did the only thing that made sense. I took his hand. Ethan's fingers curled around mine, tight, desperate. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Neither did I. But I wasn't going to let him go through this alone. I squeezed his hand, my chest aching. Then we figure it out together. His eyes met mine, searching, and in that moment, he did something I hadn't expected. He leaned in, his lips pressed against mine. Not hesitant this time, not careful, just real, just raw. It was a kiss that tasted like fear and love all at once. When we pulled away, Ethan rested his forehead against mine. Promise me something. Anything. No matter how bad this gets, you won't look at me like I'm already gone. My throat tightened. Ethan, promise me, he whispered. I closed my eyes, forcing back the tears. I promise. Even if I knew, deep down, I could never keep that promise. Time became something I measured in hospital visits, in the hours spent sitting beside Ethan while the chemo dripped into his veins. Some days were good. We laughed, we talked, we made plans like nothing had changed. Other days were hell. Ethan would get sick, too weak to even sit up. His body, once so full of energy, so alive, was slowly betraying him. And I could do nothing but watch. But I never left. No matter how hard it got, no matter how much it hurt to see him fading, I stayed. Because he was still Ethan. Still the man who made my world brighter, who had taught me how to love, who had taken my hand that night and never let go. And I would never let go either. One evening, after another round of treatment, Ethan was lying in bed, his body exhausted, but his eyes soft, warm. I was sitting beside him, my fingers tracing slow circles on his wrist. It had become a habit, something small, something that reminded us both that he was still here. Ethan smiled faintly. "You're staring." I chuckled. "You always said you liked the attention." He smirked, but it was weaker than before. "Yeah, well, guess I'll take it while I can." The words hit me harder than they should have. He saw the flicker of pain in my eyes and sighed. "Hey, don't do that." "Do what?" "Look at me like I'm disappearing." I swallowed hard. "Ethan." He squeezed my hand. "I don't want to spend whatever time I have left watching you grieve me while I'm still here." My chest tightened. "I don't know how to do this without you." Ethan's eyes softened. "You don't have to. Not yet." Not yet. The words should have been a comfort, but instead they felt like goodbye. Weeks passed, then months. Ethan fought. God, he fought. But the day came when I sat beside his bed and knew. His breathing was slower, his skin pale. He was tired. I held his hand, my fingers trembling as I whispered, "Do you remember that night, when I told you how I felt?" Ethan smiled, eyes barely open. "Yeah. I was so scared." He let out a weak chuckle. "So was I." Silence. Then with a soft breath, he said, "I love you." It was the first time he had ever said it. The first, and the last. My throat closed as I leaned forward, pressing my forehead against his. "I love you too." I felt his fingers tighten around mine. Then, slowly, they went still. The world didn't stop. But mine did. People say time heals. They say you learn to move on. But I don't think you ever truly stop loving someone. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel his hand in mine. I can still hear his voice, his laughter, the way he said my name. Ethan is gone, but our love isn't, and it never will be.